Hey, thank you very much for the beautiful introduction. I'm here to give a lecture today. I was specifically asked to talk about using principled arguments, in particular with regard to philosophical motions or softer motions. Um, so that is what I will be doing today. The general plan is to have a reasonably short lecture, somewhere between 35 and 45 minutes, where I'm going to be talking about how to craft principled arguments, how to strategically utilize them in debates, but also how to deal with other teams' principled arguments. And then I'll open the floor for a Q&A session where you guys can ask questions. Like, obviously, I see there's an immense amount of you here. So I probably won't be able to answer every single question that you might have, but there will be time for a Q&A at the end. I will share my screen in just a sec. Okay. Can people confirm that this is visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Um, so the first thing I'm going to be talking about is the skill of crafting principled arguments. And I'll try to break this down into particular steps that you need to undertake in order to create a powerful principled argument. Without further ado, I'll get into it. These are the 4 steps that I believe make up the process of crafting a principled argument. And I'm going to go through all of the steps and try to give examples as I go. The first, and this is crucial, is to provide a theoretical definition of the principle in question, an objective definition, a way of measuring the principle before you attempt to link the principle to the motion and explain why the motion fulfills or does not fulfill a principle. So before you move into crafting an argument for or against the motion through a principle lens, the question is, how do you even define or measure the principle that you are trying to utilize in the debate? So in order to explain how a motion affects the fulfillment of a principle or lack thereof, you first require a neutral metric. So for example, using the examples listed here, if you are arguing, let's say, for progressive taxation, and you want to claim that progressive taxation creates a fairer and more just distribution of wealth in society, my first prior question to that principle would be, but what even is a fair distribution of wealth? How do we define a society where wealth is distributed fairly? Because there are obviously different answers. Some would argue that a society where wealth is distributed equally would be the fairest society. Some would argue that wealth should be distributed based on merit. So this is obviously the capitalist and anti-capitalist view of wealth distribution. So in order for me to believe that a progressive tax would lead to a fairer distribution of wealth, you first need to tell me, how do you define a fair distribution of wealth? So how do you see an ideal society in terms of how wealth is distributed and why you think that's fair? And then you explain why with progressive taxation, we get more of that. If you're arguing about the criminal justice system, obviously there will be principled arguments about whether justice is better served or less served. But then the question is, what is justice? Should justice be more rehabilitative or should justice be more retributive? I think another very good example is democracy. So if you're trying to argue that a society becomes more democratic as the result of a particular motion, and you think that democracy is a principled good in and of itself, the first thing you need to do is you need to give me metrics for democracy. I can only know if society is more democratic than it was before if you tell me by which metrics do I know whether society is democratic or not. And in this case, I would say those would be perhaps 3 metrics. Number 1, to what extent do we allow and facilitate participation in the democratic process? Do we have fair and free elections, etc.? Number 2, accountability. Are the people able to hold the government to account and remove them from power should the government not fulfill expectations? And thirdly, we have representation, right? Insofar as a society is not homogeneous, but there is a multitude of different interests and preferences. A democracy is a system, and a system is more democratic the better it represents different ideas and interests and allocates preferences based on that. And then based on those metrics, we know that society has become more democratic or less democratic once we have implemented a policy. But it's absolutely crucial to define a metric. The second step, and this just seems very obvious, right? But it's to link the principle and the motion. So how does the motion fulfill or fail to fulfill the principle? If you're changing the voting system, for example, how does that make the system more democratic? So you refer to the metrics that you outlined at the beginning, and you explain how, based on those metrics, the principle is fulfilled or not. So you see, and we can analogize this to weighing. So this is a very similar process to weighing in general. We provide a metric based on which we measure which argument is more important, and then we link back to that metric, explaining why we fulfill some sort of intensity or magnitude or whichever other metric better than other teams do. The third thing is to explain why the principle matters. And again, this sounds very obvious, but oftentimes teams lose debates, not because they haven't proven their arguments, but because they haven't proven that their arguments are more important than other teams' arguments. And the stronger the room you find yourself in, the more that is going to matter. Because the stronger the room, the higher the likelihood that other teams are not saying something stupid, but rather that they're actually proving their claims. And then the debate comes down to the meta level of whose proven claim, or at least partially proven claim, is more important. So we need to explain why principles matter. And this is where people often struggle, right? Because when we have practical arguments, it's relatively easy to explain why it matters that less people die as opposed to more people dying, or that people get better healthcare or education. But when we talk about abstract philosophical concepts, that's where it gets tricky. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to give a couple of techniques which can be useful tools in your toolbox to try to demystify principles when you're explaining them and crafting them. The first helpful technique, if you're struggling with explaining why a principle matters, the question to ask is, what would the world look like if that principle were not fulfilled, if it were absent? So if you're struggling with explaining, for example, the importance of freedom of speech, the question is, how does a world look where there is no freedom of speech? That is a world where we are afraid to speak our thoughts, where we are constantly in fear of being monitored or judged, disapprobated, sanctioned, where thought crime may be a thing, where verbal crime may be a thing. It is an incredibly scary world to live in. And the reason why we want freedom of speech is to avoid what would happen if we didn't have it, right? So you can flip the claim on its head. What happens if we don't have this principle? The second thing is that it's helpful to try to connect your principles to broad, intuitive ideas that everyone agrees with. So the more you can strike a general intuition that people have, the more likely they are to buy your principle. Now, I'm going to talk about the state power principle more later on, so I'm not going to develop it in full here. But I think the state power principle is a very good example of what I'm talking about. So the state power principle is most often employed to explain that because the state has disproportionate power over its citizens, in order for it to not be tyrannical and in order for them to be able to live out dignified lives, they should have the right to choice, the right to choose a government, for example. But you can go beyond that, right? If you're not able to choose your government and how the legitimate monopoly of power, which is how we define the state as per Max Weber, is exercised over you, and then effectively you don't have control over the conditions under which you try to pursue happiness, and this means that your ability to realize your identity, your dignity, has been stripped away from you. In essence, your right to life, or at least to a dignified life, has been stripped away from you. So it's not just about choice. It's about being able to live a dignified life. And that's an intuition that everyone will have. There are some moral intuitions that ultimately, I believe, everyone shares, which is to say, even the worst of actors imaginable have some sort of intuition that certain things are wrong. They simply have different definitions of that right and wrong. But if you take a look at the worst examples of, say, genocides that happened in history, in most of those cases, people who committed those genocides did not see themselves as being people who are committing a genocide. They saw themselves as being people who are serving their homeland, which is an intuitively good thing to do. They saw themselves as people who were fighting a legitimate threat to their country and their people. A very interesting, harrowing though, but interesting example is the usage of dehumanizing language when it comes to war crimes, where people who are being targeted by ethnic cleansing or genocide are being called vermin, they're being called animals, they're being called a tumor on the body of our country. The reason for this is that we all have a basic intuition that killing another human being is wrong. So, insofar as we are commanding someone to do killing, we then try to convince them that who they're killing is not a human being. I digress. But the logic behind this is everyone has some basic moral intuitions, and the more you're able to strike those intuitions with your principles, the more persuasive the principle is going to be. The third thing, and I think this is incredibly important, analogies, which connect the principle to something very basic, very real life, help make the principle self-evident and help connect the principle to certain common sense ideas or common sense concepts. And I'm going to give a couple of examples here. The first example, this is not mine in original authorship. I've heard this example originally from Ashish Kumar, who is a legendary debater. And this is the example of harmless sexual assault or harmless rape. And already when I say harmless rape, this kind of strikes a chord. And that's exactly what it's supposed to do, because it gets the judge to listen. Now, what is this analogy? Try to explain. It's essentially an analogy which tries to prove that we care on intuition about bodily autonomy, regardless of whether there was actual harm committed when bodily autonomy was stripped. So the analogy goes as follows. Imagine there is a case of sexual assault or rape, however you want to call it, where the victim does not remember what was done to them. They will never remember what was done to them. Nobody else knows what was done to them. There is factually no way for them to ever know what happened to them. There is also no physical harm. There is no pain. There are no scars. There is absolutely no trauma left. For all intents and purposes, from the perspective of the victim, that rape did not happen. We would still be morally aghast and outraged at the fact that the rape did happen. And this proves that on intuition, even though there was no practical disutility, we still care about bodily autonomy. So we care about it beyond utility. The second example I'm going to give, this one's mine, is the example of the trans activists that, in cancel culture debates. This is just how I put it on the slide, but here's what unfolded. So I was debating with my world's partner, with Lovro. It was a classic cancel culture debate. And the team that was arguing for cancel culture was arguing that cancel culture is a legitimate form of self-defense. So when you feel offended by someone's behavior, this is also harm done to you. And it is therefore justified for you to retaliate by not consuming their service or arguing that they should be canceled or they should not be interacted with. And then the POI we gave was, okay, but you're looking at this exclusively from liberal, progressive examples and points of view. Let's imagine the opposite. Let's assume there was a trans rights activist somewhere in a very rural religious community. And not only are those people offended on the level of personal offense, if they are deeply religious, they also believe that what you're doing is a sin. So the level of offense is even greater. Surely, then it would be legitimate to cancel a trans rights activist in a very rural religious community. And this team stumbled because they either had to admit to something that they found to some extent personally disconcerting, right? They disagree with the idea that a trans rights activist should be canceled, but they would have to do this to be consistent with their principle, or they would have to be inconsistent with their principle. And this is an example of an analogy where you put a team in a position where they have to admit something which is not just necessarily strategically uncomfortable for them, but something that they don't want their case to stand for. And this puts them between a rock and a hard place. And is this to some extent a manipulative tactic? Yes. But this is also part of debating, being able to put someone in a tight spot and try to win using that. And I think it's a legitimate tactic. The last example I'm going to give, and this is how analogies break analogies, is the trolley problem. Now, we've all obviously heard of the trolley problem. So we have a situation, we find ourselves in a trolley that's going down some railroad tracks. And in front of you, there are 5 people tied to the tracks. And on the right is 1 person. In some instances, there's 3 instead of 1. But on the right side, there's fewer people than if you just keep going forward. And if you pull the lever, you're going to turn right and you're going to kill fewer people. And for most individuals, the intuition to what is the correct answer in the trolley problem is obviously you pull the lever, because 3 lives, I mean, unfortunate loss, but better than the loss of 5 lives, right? But now let's imagine a different scene and let's add a third option. And this is called the fat man analogy. I'm not sure why the guy's fat, but it's called the fat man analogy. So that's how I call it as well. So now put yourself in the perspective where you are overlooking the trolley problem from a bridge above. So you see the situation unfolding, you see the trolley going towards either the left or the right, and you choose to, of course, following the utilitarian principle, to save even more lives. And you push a fat man off a bridge in front of the trolley. He falls in front of the trolley. He obviously dies, but the trolley is stopped and nobody else is dead. Now, this sounds a lot less intuitive. Like, where do you get the right to decide which random guy just happening to be passing over the bridge dies just because you thought it was moral? And when we look at it from that perspective, the idea of you getting to choose whether the 3 people die or the 5 people die also becomes a lot more morally gray than it initially seemed. So all of these are examples, but what they serve to do, analogies force the other team to either A, explain why the analogies are not analogous, or support something that's inconvenient to them. And that's why I think analogies are incredibly crucial parts of principles. However, they're not sufficient. Analogies are not enough because other people will often not have your intuitions. And judges have different ideological positions and moral compasses. So to put it this way, a person from a liberal progressive circle would find the identity politics of the contemporary left incredibly intuitive. Pierce Morgan wouldn't. The late Charlie Kirk wouldn't. They have completely different intuitions, right? So a person who believes in capitalism has a completely different intuition as to what is fair than a person who is socialist or Marxist, which means you need to underpin the principle with analytical reasoning as well. The last step is weighing the principle. And there are 2 types of weighing, which I would say are kind of interconnected. So the first thing is that principles can most often be weighed on universality, which is to say, principles, if proven, are in most cases universally true, or at least true in the vast majority of cases. Sure, there can be exceptions, right? There is a universal right to life, unless we have a situation of self-defense where you may take another person's life to defend yourself. But like by and large, we believe in a universal right to life. The thing with practical arguments is they always include a very clear trade-off. Some people are going to gain and some people are going to lose. This is true of every policy. So no practical argument is universally true. Principal arguments can and very often are universally true if proven. So your argument simply works in more cases, and therefore the argument is more important. But second is the weighing on independence from practical outcomes, which is to say, the argument stands as a reason for or against the motion, regardless of how the practical clash unfolds. So if the motion is this house would give more votes to the poor, opening government can say we want to give more votes to the poor because then the poor people will vote more and then we're going to get better policy for poor people. And then opening opposition can say, but they won't vote more because there are other reasons why they don't vote. Maybe they are apathetic towards politics, they don't trust politicians, they don't have the time or the education, whatever. Closing government can win by saying, we don't care if they vote more. Maybe not a single poor person uses this new capacity that the state gave them. The state still has the duty to give them that capacity because the state has, for example, a reparatory duty because the reason why those people are poor are maybe they're a disenfranchised minority, which the state has structurally disprivileged, or we can argue that the state has failed them in not providing sufficient employment opportunities, whatever. But we think the state owes it to them to implement this policy and give them this chance, regardless of whether they use it, and therefore the motion should pass. And this is where you can also refer to motion phrasings, right? Most motions are phrased normatively. This house believes that X should. We are arguing that something should happen because something is a good. If we prove that it's a normative good, a principal good, it still proves that X should do Y, regardless of whether or not it has actual practical outcomes. Lastly, obviously, principles also have to be weighed against each other. Because there can be multiple principles in a debate. You can very often do this through logical priority or contingencies. Very often principles are going to be contingent on each other. So for example, the right to life, right to choice analogy I gave earlier. So long as the right to choice is proven, only then can you move on to proving that this also has to do with the right to life. But one principle is contingent on the other. But in essence, you have to weigh principles against each other as well when multiple principles are present in the round. And if the motion is principled or philosophical, there will be multiple principles present in the round because that is ultimately what the motion requires you to do. Now I want to talk a little bit about strategically utilizing principles. And some of the things I'm going to say here might sound initially unintuitive. In a principled lecture, the first thing I'm going to tell you is try to combine principles with practical arguments. There are two reasons for this. Number one is that ideally you want to have multiple independent avenues to victory. That's just general debating strategy. So you want to make sure that your arguments are not contingent on one another, because then if the judge doesn't buy your first argument, they can buy a completely different reason why you win. So maybe they don't think you fulfilled your principle, but you do prove practical outcomes, or vice versa. So in general, debating strategy should go towards having multiple independent avenues to victory. But secondly, and this is an unfortunate fact, running a principle is a high burden. People do tend to have, not out of malice, but simply out of a tendency to go down the path of least resistance, Occam's razor, whatever. There is a consequentialist bias in judging. It is simply easier to evaluate an argument which clearly says fewer people will die or fewer children will go hungry than a abstract argument on bodily autonomy or agency, which means that having practical arguments alongside principles is a way to insure yourself against that bias. And so long as a motion has practical elements, choosing to run an exclusively principled case can be done, but it's very hard because it will require you to a large degree, to either weigh out practicalities or wash them out, explain that they're not important. An example of this is in the motion, this House believes that the feminist movement should advocate for the abolition of marriage, is running the case that whether the feminist movement advocates for this or not, absolutely nothing is going to change. So we can argue exclusively about whether they have a duty to argue for that or not. But to do that, you need to prove that nothing's actually going to change. There is a way to call out judges on anti-principle bias, however. And this is similar to what you do when you're ESL in an EPL room, right? You can always say something along the lines of, panel, I know this sounds very fluffy, but we really think this argument is important, so please pay attention to the argument. In a similar way to which in ESL rooms, you can say something funny like, I'm so in love with the opening government's accents and all of that stuff, but I do think we have more substance, and here's what that substance is. Now, obviously, you need to do this in a way that's funny and relatively charming and not be arrogant. Like, you cannot come into the room and just point to the judge and be like, I know you hate principles, but nudging the judge to listen to your principled arguments more can be a technique to combat that bias. One type of motion where I would avoid running an explicit principle is an actor motion. The reason for this is that the manual is ambiguous. The manual tells you that you are allowed to run principle arguments in actor motions so long as you explain why the actor cares about that principle. So, for example, you can argue that an orthodox religious parent, orthodox in the sense of deep belief, not in the sense of the particular denomination of Christianity, should follow religious principles and raise their child in religious principles because that is what they believe in and that's what brings them fulfillment. But that's no longer a principle then, right? That's a utilitarian claim. Because if you are required to explain why the principle is in the actor's interest, then you're not arguing that something should be done because that something is objectively good. You're arguing that it should be done because the actor draws some kind of utility or fulfillment out of it, or that's the way the actor defines utility. So ultimately, principles in actor debates are legitimate so long as they're utilitarian, i.e. so long as they're not principles. So I would just avoid that confusion and just focus on the interests of the actor. Now, when it comes to defending principles, there are three things I would say. Number one, principles are binaries. They're either proven or unproven. People either have the right to freedom of speech or they don't. Or we can argue extents, but on the basic level, it's a binary. We either think that bodily autonomy is important or we don't think that bodily autonomy is important. So there must be a response to the principle, because if the other side doesn't respond to your principle, they are in fact conceding the full principle. And this leads me to point B, which is that people will often fail to respond to principles and often fail to fully respond to principles, which should be pointed out. This is, again, a general element of debating strategy. You need to point out when the other team is not responsive to you. Obviously, you need to explain why that matters for the outcome of the round. So when they don't respond to this argument, here is why that wins us the round. Here is why that's a particular concession on their side. Here is why that negates some of their case. Because obviously just saying they don't respond will not trigger a reaction with the judge, because obviously you think they don't respond. That's your job as a debater. But if you explain why it matters, then the judge also reacts. And the last thing is that when you're building your principle, you need to remember to be specific. And this is a form of preemptive defense, because a very common attack from other teams, and an attack that you can utilize, is, okay, we agree with the principle and we think it should be fulfilled. but why would it be fulfilled in this particular way? So we think the state has a reparatory duty towards poor people. We absolutely agree. We just don't think the way to resolve that is by giving them more votes, because that can result in negative impacts. For example, politicians will over-focus on redistributive policies, and maybe that's bad. So not just why there is a principle to be fulfilled, and the motion perhaps fulfills it, but why does it uniquely fulfill it, or fulfill it better than a potential alternative could fulfill it. Now, dealing with principles and how to attack a principled argument. The most common and most obvious form of attack is to try to portray the principled argument as being contingent on practicalities, i.e., you're trying to prove that a practical clash is a logically prior necessity for a principle to work. Which is to say, if we take the reparatory duty example from this house to give more votes to the poor, an attack you can use is to say the logic behind the reparatory duty is that people get reparations, so their lives are meaningfully better to the same extent to which they were made meaningfully worse before. So for the reparatory duty to be fulfilled, we need their lives to become practically better. So if poor people won't vote, you did not fulfill the reparatory duty. You just did a symbolic gesture. So you need to implement a policy which will actually make their lives meaningfully better. So you try to portray the principle as being contingent on the practical, and then by taking down the practical, you've also taken down the principle. It's a way of like a linchpin strategy. And also obviously call out practical arguments disguised as principles. Like teams are very often going to talk like for 3 minutes about practicalities and then say, this proves it's principally justified. No, it doesn't. That's a practical argument. So just call it out when it happens so judges know that it's one single argument and not separate principle and practical clashes. The second thing is, insofar as analogies are important, it's also important to try to disarm analogies, especially if they're unrealistic. So take the harmless rape analogy, right? It seems very convincing. It proves that we care intuitively about bodily autonomy. But the realistic response is to say, that's not a good way of arguing for bodily autonomy, because there is no such thing as a harmless rape. In that hypothetical situation, our intuitive reaction might be what you say, but since that situation does not exist, that principle is not applicable to real life. So when you can disarm analogies or flip them, explain why they work for your side, that's a very strong way of dealing with a principle. Thirdly, again, common element of debating strategy, but I think it works more here because people find it harder to weigh their principles and find it harder to explain why their principles are important than they do for practicalities. So when that mistake happens and there is a lack of weighing or a lack of importance analysis, that should be called out. Lastly, and this is a technique which can work offensively and defensively, you can turn practicalities into principles, which is to say, you can argue on utility and then also argue that something is principally justified because it is utilitarian and because it provides more utility. And the way you argue for it is as follows. All preferences we have as individuals are subjective because we are all infected a priori with our own unique experiences, desires, ideologies, moral compasses, and all these combine in each individual to create a unique person. No two people are alike, which is to say, we are unable to measure between the importance of different people's preferences. We're unable to measure between the value, objective value of different people's preferences. And even if there were a way to objectively measure it, we're unable to access it as humans. Because in order to objectively measure something, we would have to define an objective metric. We cannot search for an objective metric because we are subjective. So we are epistemically unable to do that. And this ultimately means we're also unable to measure the value of different human beings. There is no way for me to say that one human being is more valuable than another because I don't have a metric to do so. This is why the intuition goes that if I were to kill everyone in this room and harvest their organs and then donate those organs further on, I would definitely save more lives than I would have taken away. But the problem is that you have an equal right to live, just as the guy in the hospital waiting for a kidney or waiting for a liver. If we're unable to measure between different unique moral actors, then the only thing we can defer to is maximizing the total pleasure and minimizing the total pain of the largest amount of actors. Therefore, something is principally justified when it brings more utility than disutility. So both offensively and defensively, you can try to argue utilitarianism as a principle. And now the last thing I want to do is to provide some examples of principal arguments that have happened or I have run or I've heard run in certain common debates, which can be replicated elsewhere. Now, obviously, this is not an exhaustive list, but um, this is just some examples of how good principles are crafted. Firstly, we have an argument for bodily autonomy. The example motion I gave here is this has would allow people to sell themselves into slavery. This is where you argue. I would say that bodily autonomy comes from propriety, which is to say we are the proprietors of our bodies. Our bodies are the vessels that are inhabited by our thoughts and by our nervous systems, which is to say we are in ownership of our bodies. Therefore, we should follow the same principle we generally follow with ownership, which is to say we're allowed to make stupid decisions with our property. So I'm allowed to sell my house for $1. That would be incredibly stupid because I would have $1 and no house. However, the state cannot and or should not legally prevent me from doing that because that is my property. I'm allowed to use my property so long as I don't use it to harm somebody else's property or autonomy or whatever. And since selling oneself into slavery does not harm the bodily autonomy of others, it should be allowed. And you can also combine it with the utilitarian principle explaining that obviously every person has a subjective definition of utility. And for one individual, it's more utile to sell themselves into slavery than, for example, be pursued by loan sharks or whatever. Then this is something that should be allowed. The second would be the argument for democracy, also known as the state power principle. And you've probably heard it many times. I am going to deliberate here. So it goes as follows. The state has a disproportionate amount of power over the individual citizen. There are three reasons for that. Number one is that through its policy and its legislation, the state crafts the material conditions of your existence, which is to say, the framework under which you pursue happiness and whatever is the definition of a good life for you happens within the framework of the education policy that the state provides or doesn't provide, the welfare policy, the healthcare policy, the defense policy. So in essence, the state is the framework under which you live your life. Secondly, even if you disagree with that framework, you don't have the capacity to meaningfully disagree because the state has massive coercive power it can employ against you. It has the courts, the police, the prison system, the military. So you are forced to do the state's bidding even if you don't want to. But the third thing is that the state, insofar as the world as we know it is made up of states, is fundamentally inescapable so long as you want to live in a civilized society. So you perhaps dislike the country you live in and you can move to another country. But again, you are under the yoke of a state, just a different state with different legal frameworks, which is to say that your lives are massively determined by the state and you are unable to physically resist the state. This means that in order to have any control over your life, you need to be able to control how this massive power is utilized on you or upon you. And that's why democracy, for example, is a justified system. That's why we should give more votes to the poor. In general, motions that involve the relationship of the state towards its citizens are relevant for this argument. Thirdly, we have the argument for identity, which is also very common. The example motion I gave here is this house would prohibit companies from taking a stance on social issues. And looking at it from an opposition perspective, why we should not prohibit them from doing so. We start with the idea of the importance of identity expression on an individual level, which is the following. Nobody can interact with our self, uh, in the sense of the self, directly, because nobody can access our thoughts, nobody can access our emotions. So people never actually fully interact with us as a person, but they interact with the outwardly perception that we project towards others. They interact with their idea of us and not with the self in and of itself. Um, this means that in order for people to be able to control their social interactions, their social circumstances, in order for them to be able to control how they are perceived, they need to be able to express their identity. If they're not able to express their identity, then they fundamentally cannot project themselves to other individuals, which is bad both in terms of the fact that they are stripped of their own uniqueness as a person, but also the fact that they are then unable to control how others see them. And then we connect this to the particular motion, right? So as taking a stance on social issues is a very important part of a person's identity. Um, and you want others to perceive you as having a particular stance because you care about that stance. So everybody has an opinion on, for example, the war in Gaza. Everyone has an opinion on important issues like LGBTQ rights or abortion rights or whatever. We think that individuals should have the right to define, to express those opinions. If individuals should have the right to express those opinions, why shouldn't companies? Because companies aren't monoliths. Companies are ultimately made up of individuals. They are aggregates of individuals. So, and here's the analogy. If government would like to strip corporations from this form of expression, then they also need to explain why they would not strip individual people of the right to this form of expression. Where again, they have to either accept that they would do that as well, which is hard, or they have to explain why there is a difference, which is also reasonably hard. Fourthly, we have the argument for utilitarianism. I'm not going to develop it in detail because I did that on the previous slide, but I'm just to apply it to an example, allowing the use of torture when interrogating terrorist suspects. This is a motion which is very often upweighted because people find it very unintuitive that we should cause cruel or unnatural harm to people. And also then you combine it with the argument of inefficiency, like, very often you just don't get the correct information. But then if you use the utilitarian principle I described on the previous slide, then it's easier to justify it. There is a massive amount of disutility inflicted upon one person. But there is also a chance, perhaps not a 100% chance, maybe not even 50, that we would be saving the lives of hundreds of people or thousands of people. We would be preventing a Paris terrorist attack. We'd be preventing a 9/11. In this situation, where we cannot judge between different unique moral actors, we preference the value of preserving the majority. The next example I will point out is the argument for self-defense. The example motion used here is this how supports eco-terrorism, where again, you first define self-defense. The reason why you call it self-defense is because of the reasons I explained earlier. It's intuitive that self-defense is a good thing and people should have the right to it. That's why you call the principle the right to self-defense in a situation. You are triggering an intuition. So what is self-defense? So which criteria need to be fulfilled for something to be considered self-defense? So number one, you need to be in a situation which is otherwise inescapable. There are no other means for you to escape a situation rather than to retaliate against someone or something which is putting you in a particular position. So it's a state of dire necessity. And number two, the response is proportional. So if you can exit a situation by maiming a person and you're able to, I don't know, knock them unconscious and escape, you're not allowed to also shoot them dead while they're on the floor. And you're not allowed to, kill their family because they hurt you, like blood vengeance or whatever. And then you connect to the motion, which to say, number one, the situation is otherwise inescapable. Because we see that despite all policy efforts, COP conferences, Paris agreements, with Kyoto protocols, whatever, we still are not meeting climate targets, and parts of the world will be underwater in like 20 or 30 years. And secondly, the response is proportional because we are in a situation of dire threat to our lives. So it's proportional to respond by direly threatening the lives of others or the infrastructure or property of others. So analogy, linkage, analytical explanation. Lastly, and this is just here because I really like the argument, is the argument for allowing religious expression. So for example, if the motion is this house would ban public displays of religion, and you're arguing for the opposition side, so you would allow people to wear the veil, to wear a cross, to pray in public. I think there's a two-pronged principle here. The first is the idea that religious expression is existential in a way that other forms of expression are not. Because it supersedes material existence. All other forms of expression, whether they be your sexual identity, gender identity, political identity, are important parts of your lives, but they're only a part of your life. They form a limited part of your entire existence as a person. Religious expression has to do with the eternal salvation or damnation of the soul, which means it's an all-consuming form of expression in terms of its importance. Why? Because religious expression, for example, wearing a veil, following the code that is prescribed by the religion, is of course the part to is part of the path to being a pious person. And being a pious person is what leads you closer to salvation and further away from damnation. Which is to say that allowing people the right to express themselves religiously, in fact, and it's where you do the intuition, in fact amounts to a right for people to save themselves from a fate worse than death, which is eternal damnation. Now, the response to that argument would obviously be, oh, but this is only true if heaven and hell and God actually exist. What if they don't? And I think the response is twofold. The first is to say, insofar as one believes in a deity, for them, the consequences are very much real, and the fear of those consequences are very much real. So if somebody is morally opposed to abortion and has had to perform an abortion for whatever reason, so maybe their country doesn't allow for conscientious objection or whatever, and they conceive of abortion as murder because of religious reasons, they will conceive of themselves as a murderer. For all intents and purposes, from their perspective, they are a murderer and equal to any other murderer. Regardless of whether ultimately they have committed a sin, maybe sin doesn't exist because God doesn't exist, but that's their perspective. So there's a quote in sociological canon that says, insofar as people believe things are real, they are real in their consequences. The second response is to say that we don't know if there is a metaphysical world or heaven or hell or a God, but absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, which is to say it may be very likely that paradise and inferno exist. We just don't have the epistemic faculties in order to determine that. And if they do exist, the consequences are infinite because salvation and damnation and things pertaining to the soul are infinite. So if there is even a minimal chance that they exist, and we have no evidence that they don't, the state has a duty to facilitate people's religious expression, because if they don't, they're principally negligent, because should heaven and hell exist, they have been complicit in the damnation of someone's soul, or at least in how do you say, blocking or unfacilitating their path to the opposite, to salvation. And that's the note on which I'm going to end. I think this took around 45 minutes. My intended length for this was like around an hour or so. So it's open to questions now. So I don't know what's best. Perhaps put them in chat rather than verbally, because there's so many of you. Maybe that's the best way to proceed. I guess just type your questions in chat, and then I can go answering one by one. And also because I think many of you are going to have similar questions, and I can combine the answers. So people who are raising their hands can just type in the chat. Combining the principles with pragmatics simply means that you have a principled argument and a practical argument, which is to say you have two independent claims. One is to say the motion should pass because it's normatively principally justified, and then there's also a practical reason why the motion should pass or not pass. That's what I meant by combining principles with pragmatics. If you meant more literally, then that would be the utilitarian principle I described. So explaining that utilitarianism in and of itself is a principle, and then something that's principally justified. Something is principally justified because it brings more utility than disutility. That would be I would say, two potential different answers to the question in the chat. Okay, running the right to property in a debate about redistribution. So I think the intuitive argument would be as follows. There is a level of duty that individuals have towards the state in terms of taxation, insofar as the state facilitated their acquisition of property, which is to say the state provided you with a defense of its borders. The state provided you with enforcement of contracts. You perhaps used the state's services, such as education, to get the skills you needed to acquire your property. And the value of that is calculated into tax. Beyond that, there is no moral duty to any other actor, because beyond that, your property was acquired through your own faculties. And then you can run the following difference, which is to say, it may be nice of you to redistribute and to give to charity. However, you don't have an obligation to do so, because obligations are created through interaction, and that interaction never happened. The only interaction was between you and the state, and that is paid through tax. With regards to the lottery of birth thing, I would say that's the same response. The lottery of birth is unfortunate, but it doesn't produce a particular duty towards you as an individual. It's unfortunate that some people are born in poverty, but why should I be the one to service their poverty as opposed to anyone else? And then the burden is on the other team to demonstrate that. There's also a question to explain the principle of utilitarianism again. So that would be to say the following: we do not know, we cannot determine, because we are all inherently subjective, and therefore our subjective lenses are not suitable to determine that. We cannot determine the value, objective value of people's preferences, nor can we determine the value of a particular person to say and one human being is more valuable than another. If that's the case, the only thing we can be certain of is that it's better, the best possible outcome is to maximize the pleasure of the largest amount of people and minimize the pleasure of the largest amount of people. Uh, so there's also a question about what is the best thing to do when we know that what we said is absolutely principally wrong during the debate. Uh, I mean, if your question is what to do if you personally think it's principally wrong, that's just not a debating question. If the question is, what do you do if you realize you've ran a principle which didn't work? The response to that is you ask the judge for targeted feedback. You don't just go and say, we want feedback for the round, because unfortunately, most often you're just going to get a retelling of what happened in the round or a retelling of the OA. But you ask for targeted feedback on your principles. So how could I have run the principle better? How could I have defended the principle better? Should I have run this principle? Maybe I should have run a different one, or maybe I shouldn't have run a principle. And in general, I would advise that you ask for targeted feedback from judges instead of just asking for general feedback. Um, then there's a question: when you are employing niche arguments, you have a fair chance of not striking a chord with the judges. Like if you use arguments like evolutionary arguments against naturalism, it cannot connect. But if it does, your case stands out. So any caveats in using academic arguments like that or deductive formulations? This is a question that's very hard to answer specifically because it really just depends on what the motion is. Um, so I could answer a specific example, but in general, it just comes down to your perception, whether you will be able to phrase the principle in a way that strikes a chord with the judges. Sometimes it's just a good decision to not run a principle. Sometimes it's just a good decision to take the basic practical arguments, run them well, take the first or the second, and move on to the next round. You can also determine this based on the judge, right? You will over time you get to know judges, you know whether they prefer principles or not, and sometimes you have to make a strategic decision to not run a principle because the judge might be anti-principle bias. I think that would be the answer to that question. Is it recommended to run principles from CG or mathematics? So what I would do with my partner is I would first explain why we win the practical clash, and then I would go along the lines of, but it doesn't even matter whether we win the practical clash because we think there's a principle in this debate that's relevant. So ensure that you win the deadlock on the practical, or you at least have some engagement on the practical, that you're not completely out of the round, and then you run the principle as an even if. So even if we don't win the practical clash, or it's not important, we have a principle which we believe wins the round as well. So can I say more about how to go about the fully responding thing? I think this what it was trying to say there is that sometimes people are going to give a half-assed response to your principle, right? They're gonna say, it's contingent on the practical, but they're not gonna explain why, or they're gonna give a one-liner response to your principle. So in that case, you point out, okay, there is a response, but we don't think the response is complete because here is the specific part of our principle you don't answer, and here is why that part of the principle is important. Then there's a question of, is it a valid pushback to the popular reasons as to why the state has a lot of control over people, simply the fact that an alternative to statehood was the state of nature that had life as nasty, brutish, and short? I think this explains why the state is necessary. So if you are arguing, so if the motion is this house believes that the state is immoral, that would be a solid utilitarian principle claim. The state is not immoral because without the state, we would live in a type of existence which would be even more immoral or would facilitate more immorality. So it can be a good pushback, but again, it depends on the motion. So there's also a question with regard to neoliberal principles. Is it a good strategy to defend or prove a neoliberal principle with biases? I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that, but if you are asking whether you should utilize analogies that somehow tied to the neoliberal principle? The answer would be yes. I'm not quite sure what exactly the question is there. Then, as a judge or as a debater, how can I weigh principle versus a practical argument? Well, essentially, what you do as a debater, I've given the examples of how the weighing is done. So you explain that either the principle is more universal than the practical, or you explain that the principle is true regardless of the practical, or you explain that the principle is more important than the practical. As a judge, the first thing you do is you take a look at the weighing the teams have provided. So have teams weigh their arguments. And then you look at the reasons for that weighing and you interpret that weighing against each other. Which team has provided better weighing? If there is no weighing present, you determine the analytical the analytical depth and the analytical relevance of those arguments. So was the argument proven? If the argument was proven, was it proven more or less than another team's argument? And then we take a look at the implications of that proof and we weigh those implications against one another. And obviously here we get to subjectivity, because there is no objectively good way to judge a debate insofar as judges will be subjective people. And when you come to that final step where teams have not done weighing and you need to weigh the importance of their implications, different judges will have different weighings. And that's why we have splits on panels, especially in complex rounds. So the advice then for debaters would be to do as much explicit weighing as possible to prevent that situation. Then, can a deontological principle be credited in debates? Yes, it can be. Short answer. If it's developed well, it can be. There's no reason for it to not be credited. Then there is a question about this also to push the button motion in Dogsbridge. Again, I'm not exactly sure what the question is referring to. You choose your weighing framings based on which makes best. Or is it easy to do something? And secondly, based on a particular metric and whether you think you can explain within the context of that motion. So that would be the general answer. Then the question is, okay, we have examples of deontological arguments in debates. I mean, a deontological argument is any argument that attempts to explain that something is justified or is inherently justified or inherently unjustified. An example of this would be the bodily autonomy argument that I gave, the harmless rape analogy. That would be a deontological claim, because you are claiming that regardless of the of utility or disutility, so practically there was no harm to that sexual assault, but you still claim it's unjustified. So the bodily autonomy argument could be an example of that. And these arguments can be credited over utilitarian principles, so long as you explain why they matter, regardless of utilitarian principles, which I think, again, the harmless rape analogy is an example of that. In terms of re-explaining the state power principle, and then we also have a question on retribution in criminal justice, and I think that would be right about the end of the Q&A, because we're reaching 3:30 my time. The state power principle, right. So the state has an immense amount of power and control over the individual for three reasons. Number one, because through the fact it creates laws, it creates a set of rules which you have to abide by when you go about your day-to-day life. So your pursuit of happiness within the context of the state is dependent on the laws and regulations and services provided by the state. Secondly, even if you disagree with the state and you don't want to abide by the law, you are forced to, because otherwise the state is going to coerce you into it or going to punish you or sanction you. So the state can put you in prisons, the state can prosecute you, the state can even implement the military. But thirdly, it's almost impossible to avoid the state. So you can move from one state to another, but you can't really avoid being in a state. Insofar as that's true, your lives are massively determined by the state. So in order for you to have any real control over your life, you need to have control over the state. And this is an argument which you can use, for example, in favor of more democracy, or in any motion that has to do with the relation of the state and its citizens. Right, so the retribution question. I honestly wouldn't make the claim that suffering for suffering's sake is good. I think that's a very high burden claim to make. I would run the retribution principle through the lens of there being a duty to provide some restitution to the victim because the state has already failed them in not preventing the crime, and therefore it has a reparatory duty to provide restitution. Part of that restitution is the feeling of regaining control that you get when you know that despite the crime that was done to you, you are moving on with your life, you have control, as opposed to that person who is suffering, for example, languishing in prison. So I would avoid um, the idea of suffering for suffering's sake. In terms of examples of how to run principles in an actor motion, I will repeat the advice I said before. Don't. You can explain that it's that an actor cares about a particular principle. So if it's this house as a religious parent would raise their child to be religious, you can explain why the parent cares about their kid also having the same faith. I would not run an explicit principle because ultimately the manual tells you that you have to explain that the actor cares about the principle. At that point, it's no longer a principle because you're not arguing that something is justified because it's justified. You're arguing that it should be done because the actor likes it or it provides them with more utility. Um, so, okay, I will. Okay, it's 3:30 my time, so I'll be closing the Q&A. I will respond to the questions that are still that are in the chat, but after I do that, that would pretty much be it because I feel that we've already like had 15 or more questions. So just to preserve time. Um, so there is a question about explaining the harmless rape analogy with the bodily autonomy motion. I'm not sure what you mean. So this can be used in any motion that where you're explaining that bodily autonomy is important, and you use this analogy to explain that we care about it even when there are no practical outcomes done. So this is an analogy which can be used in different debates. Do you determine based on the motion whether you're going to run that analogy or not? Then we have a question on how can we convince a judge that an actor will act emotionally or rationally? Uh, I mean, the problem is here that I don't know what your past experience is because what you wrote in the chat is in fact the way to go. You do try to explain actors' experiences. You try to put yourself in the shoes of an actor and explain in depth how they feel. So don't just say people are sad, but when people are in this situation, here is why they are in incredible despair. Here's how this despair looks. Here's the thoughts that go to their head. Or you use analogies of similar situations where people have acted in similar ways. So we think Donald Trump, for example, is going to do this particular thing because we saw that he did it in his first term, right? So I think that would be the way to go. Now, why do judges tend to go towards utility as opposed to deontological principles? That's unfortunate. The reason for that is essentially that it's easier. It's path of least resistance uh, uh, to determine that people not dying is important, or people not going hungry is important, or people not being in pain is important, than it is to talk about abstract values and concepts. It's just an unfortunate truth of why judges do that. A specific way to debate on the harm principle. Um, Again, depends on the motion. The harm principle just essentially says, if it's the harm principle you're referring to, that our rights only extend so far as they do not harm other people's rights. So the boundaries of our rights are defined by harm done or not done to others. That's an argument to explain that certain limitations on rights need to exist. For example, we limit speech to some extent, like we limit Holocaust denial because we feel that it would be offensive, for example, to survivors or families of survivors of the Holocaust. So that's an example of the harm principle. But again, without a particular motion, there is no way for me to answer more specifically. That's in essence the um, the entirety of the questions that I will answer, because there's already been quite a lot and been going on with for like 20 minutes, and I think some of them. There is the question on convincing a judge a deontological principle is more important than a utilitarian principle. Again, it's very hard to give a specific answer. It comes down to explaining that we care about certain things regardless of utility. Again, the harmless rape analogy is an example of that. The fat man problem is an example of the fat man trolley problem is an example of that. The idea of me not having the right to harvest all of your organs, even if it would save more people, is an example of that. But the ultimate answer to the question is you need to explain why it matters more. I think the techniques I gave within this lecture are helpful for that. But there is no, how to say, one size fits all silver bullet type of analysis that I can give you. Uh, People are asking about slides. Was this recorded?
I don't think so. Yeah, it wasn't.
Yes, this is being recorded.
Okay, then there's no need for me to send slides. Orcom can just distribute the recording to whoever wants the recording. I think that's the best way to progress. So you can get, so in the recording you will see the slides, right? So you will get both the slides and and me explaining them. So I would just say Orcom can disseminate this to whoever they want to disseminate it to, or whoever wants it. Yeah. Yeah, and that's it. I hope I answered all of your questions. I'm sorry that for some of them I could not answer specifically, but in those situations it was either I did not fully understand what you were asking, or it was hard to answer specifically without a specific motion or specific example. But I tried to answer your questions to the best of my capacity. So yeah, thank you guys for attending and for listening in and for being active with your questions. And we'll see you at the tournament.
Yeah, I just want to ask, where can you get the recording?
Hi, we'll share the recordings when the tournament is over on our YouTube channel. We'll let you guys know.
Oh, thanks.